So that's wonderful. Great. Wonderful. Well, welcome everybody. We'd love to welcome our students, our alumni, the fundraising school participants, Mays Family Institute followers, and other friends of the school. We are truly pleased today to have as our guest Molly Brennan, founding partner and executive vice president, Koya Partners, as well as managing partner, nonprofit practice lead for the Diversified Search Group. Today, Molly will share with us her ideas about the future of philanthropic work and what trends and opportunities she's seeing in the nonprofit world. She would also give us some advice on career planning, what sets candidates apart from others, and how to build a career towards an executive position. Molly will start us off with a presentation about her firm and herself, and then I will start us off with a few questions before we turn to questions from the audience. Molly, we are delighted that you could join us, and we are so looking forward to learning with you and from you. Welcome to the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here and to meet with all of you. I do have a PowerPoint that I'll pull up in a second, but maybe just to start off by saying, I never planned to be a recruiter. I never thought about being in recruiting. And in fact, I think if you ask most executive recruiters, they will tell you that. We were almost all recruited into it. But one of the most amazing things about my job that has remained true for the better part of 15 years is I get to interact with brilliant people who are committed to making the world a better place day in and day out, both on my team and with all the clients and candidates that we have the honor of interacting with. And I know that this group of folks here today and affiliated with the school, share that. And so it's really an honor just to be with people who share that kind of commitment and passion. And I also wanted to just say from where we are today in this week with the news coming out of Buffalo, New York, and out of California, that in really challenging, dark times, I find a lot of personal sort of solace in the fact that I know there are so many people who are fighting for good, fighting for equity, fighting for everybody to have a chance to do well in this world and to do great things. And I do find a lot of solace in that. And so that's an important part of the work that I do too. So let me see if I can smoothly pull this PowerPoint up. And hopefully this is working for everybody. Yes, great. So I'm Molly Brennan. I know my title is kind of ridiculously long, so I can just say, so originally I'm a founding partner at Koya Partners, which is a search firm that was started up a little over 15 years ago with the idea that back then sort of felt revolutionary, was that nonprofits should have the same access to talent and talent services that corporations have. Luckily, now we're sort of in a world where I think that is a given for many nonprofits. There's a lot more competition in this space, which I think is a great thing. It means that more mission-driven organizations are gaining access to great leaders. So I am videoing in from Newburyport, Massachusetts, where I live. And I was just saying we're enjoying one of our first beautiful spring days today. So I'm very pleased about that. So Koya was acquired about 3 years ago by Diversified Search Group, which is about 300 people strong. And Koya really makes up the nonprofit practice there. So I lead that part of our firm. And then we have in our family of firms at Diversified Search Group, other boutique firms that are focused on higher education, healthcare, biotech, and the corporate sector as well. So we've won as a firm a couple of accolades. One that I'm, particularly proud of is this award that you see here on this slide by WOKE, the Woman of Color in Fundraising and Philanthropy, because I think that's a field that, fundraising and philanthropy in particular, that, really needs to and is becoming slowly much more diverse. And so I think it's important as recruiters that we be part of those efforts too. As the nonprofit practice, we operate across a really wide range of sort of mission focused areas, from advocacy to food and nutrition to foundations to global organizations. youth development, really all of these areas that you see here. And, you know, we have the honor of working with some truly amazing clients, both some of the big names that you'll see on this slide, but also some startup nonprofits, you know, newer, smaller organizations. We really have purposely kept a very diverse client base. I thought it might be helpful just to share a couple of sort of current hiring trends with you that we're seeing. I will say first, this market that we're in right now is like nothing I've ever experienced. There are so many opportunities. There's so much competition for candidates. You know, it's really having an effect on our work, but also on sort of you know, anybody looking for a job, thinking about making a change. You know, this is a really unique moment, and I'll certainly get into more of that as we go forward a little bit. But the first big trend is probably obvious, but this is a candidate-driven market. You know, candidates are in the driver's seat when it comes to just about everything from compensation to transition times, to where they work, when they start. All of those factors are really in the candidate's sort of lap right now, which is wonderful for candidates, but obviously creates a much more challenging situation for employers, you know, who really have to be responsive to that market. The other piece that's a big trend right now is extensive turnover. I'm sure everyone's read about the Great Resignation, you know, and it's really true. There are a lot of factors driving it, you know, but the numbers show that this is a definite trend that is not yet slowing down, even with talk about what might change in the economy. Studies show that right now, more than 50% of workers are thinking about leaving their jobs. And I'm quite sure that all of you have colleagues who've resigned, people who've left, probably have vacancies where you work. You know, this is just a trend that we're all seeing right now and feeling and living. There are literally, the last jobs report showed that there are more jobs than there are open jobs than there are workers. And we're certainly seeing that in the nonprofit sector, as well as sort of writ large across the whole economy. There's a lot of reasons for this. I think, you know, coming off of the pandemic, if indeed we are coming off of the pandemic, you know, there's a lot of burnout, there's a lot of exhaustion. I think there's this really strong desire to find a different way of balancing work and life and to find really meaningful work. I think all of that is driving it. Of course, there's also just the truth that for people who want to make a change right now, this is an advantageous moment, you know, to increase your income, to gain a higher level role with more responsibilities and more growth. You know, this is a good moment for that. And that, of course, leads to the next point, which is just this, as I mentioned before, this highly competitive landscape. We see this playing out in all of our searches. So it's something, you know, for candidates, it's still a wonderful thing, but it's important to really understand this market and sort of position yourself well in that, which I can talk a little bit about later. I think the other piece that is a definite trend is this focus on diverse candidate pipelines. Our clients, more than ever, really are really prioritizing diversity in their hiring. Leaders of color tell me that they are being recruited at an extraordinary rate. And I think this is a much needed priority, and it's, you know, long overdue, but it's certainly adding to this sort of competitive landscape that we're seeing right now. And then the last piece that, you know, certainly is a strong trend that I think is probably here to stay in some form is the virtual hiring process. The vast majority of our clients right now are at most seeing finalists in person, sort of toward the end of the search process, which means that, you know, rounds 1, 2, 3, or in many cases 5, 6, and 7, depending on the client, are by video. So I think as a candidate, you know, it's really critical to be skilled at these virtual interviews. And I think it also means that there's more openness on the client end and more comfort with allowing candidates to work virtually or to open up job searches to virtual employees. You know, I think that's the part that might change as we move further away from the pandemic. That really remains to be seen, but I think that connects back to this competitive landscape. You know, if candidates are demanding flexibility in terms of location, clients and hiring managers are having to respond by offering that. So those are a couple of the big trends that that I've been seeing. And I'll just talk a little bit first about what I think our clients are seeking, and then what I think candidates are looking for, and then pause. That will be sort of the end of the presentation part. So on the client side, I think there's lots of parallels to the big trends I just mentioned. Certainly, I think when clients are thinking about making a senior hire, they're looking at mission and culture add. And I use that term add very deliberately. I think leading edge clients are actively moving away from this idea of culture fit, which I think emphasizes sameness as opposed to diversity and thought and background and experience. And this idea of culture add is this concept that new hires can expand and strengthen a culture by bringing different lived experience, different perspectives, different professional experiences to the table. So I think that is more critical than ever. Resilience, adaptability, those are just critical, I think, for us in our personal lives and professional lives right now. You know, those are just really critical no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing. And I think employers are definitely seeking those qualities. Another word that comes up a lot in all of our searches, really across levels, across sectors, is innovation. And I think this is one of those terms that can be defined and demonstrated in a lot of different ways. But my clients are often asking us, tell us what a candidate has created, or what have they changed? How have they adapted to different circumstances with new ideas? And I think that's really a big piece of connected to resilience and adaptability as well. Certainly, comfort with fast-paced change is here to stay. And I think this is really one of the things that I find clients and recruiters actually often really struggle to assess. And I think candidates actually often lack some self-awareness about how comfortable they really are with fast-paced change. So I think if you're thinking about a new role and this comes up a lot in interviews, I think that's something to flag and really think about, you know, what is my comfort level with change? How much change do I really feel good about? Because I think most organizations are going to be in a period of change for a while now, and different organizations handle that in different ways. And then the last piece that comes up in every search that we do is facility with diversity, equity, inclusion issues and discussions. You know, this is all about how individuals have done their own work themselves around diversity, equity, inclusion, and about, you know, how they have woven that work, that understanding, that perception, and that practice into their professional lives as managers, as colleagues, and as sort of being that form of culture add that I mentioned before. And then this is my last slide in the deck here, but this is really what we're hearing from candidates. So I'm going to guess that this might resonate with many folks here who might be thinking about a career change. Candidates are certainly seeking meaning and impact. I think this is one of those factors, as I said earlier, that's really driving this great resignation. It's this idea that work that doesn't feel meaningful or isn't creating impact isn't sustainable anymore. You know, for something that you devote so much of your time and energy to, takes you away from other parts of your life, that it really must have meaning and impact. That's critical. I think the other piece we're hearing from candidates over and over again is flexibility. Flexibility about when and how they get their work done, how often they need to be in the office. In the nonprofit space, we're seeing many of our clients adopting sort of this hybrid office approach. You know, again, as I said earlier, I don't know where that will go, but I will say that most of the candidates that I'm talking to, even at the CEO level, want that level of flexibility. So I think that's really important. Growth is also critical. You know, I think when we talk to sort of emerging leaders, maybe not quite at the CEO or C-suite level, but maybe ready to move into that level, what we're really hearing is this sense that you're paying your dues or waiting for promotions or raises. That's an outdated concept that I think candidates really want to know exactly what specifically their managers, how they will support them in growth, what opportunities are ahead, what does that timeline look like? You know, I think candidates really really are seeking that clear pathway for growth, and employers who don't offer that will lose out on top talent. I think connection points are also really important. They're important to all of us in every way, right? And I think in a hybrid or mostly virtual world, it's even more important. And I've been seeing that the organizations that have adapted most successfully to a hybrid or virtual environment by finding creative ways to connect employees to each other, to ensure that employees stay connected to the mission, to the communities that they serve, those are the organizations that will really win sort of this fight for top talent, because that's what people are really seeking. And finally, candidates, just as clients are prioritizing this, candidates are also prioritizing a strong culture of inclusion and belonging. When we're talking with candidates and trying to tell them about a new opportunity or a role, no matter what that role might be, it could be a CFO, it could be a programs person, it could be a fundraiser. One of the questions we almost always get is, what has this organization done to create equity, to increase diversity, to ensure that all employees feel like they belong? And I think candidates are really looking for specifics there. So that's sort of just a little bit of an overview of some of the big trends that we're seeing with in this hiring market with candidates and clients. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and hopefully there's some questions.
Well, thank you so much, Molly. Allow me to start us off with a few of my questions, and then we'll turn to our colleagues in the audience. And thank you for giving us that overview of trends, of what you think organizations are looking for, and then what you see your candidates looking for. So let me begin with the theme of diversity and building inclusive teams. And you're saying that both organizations are looking for this as a priority, but also candidates as well. So and sometimes I guess those two things, people have different ideas of what that means. So can you share some sense of what are organizations looking for leaders to do in their journeys in DEI, and maybe some of them have gone beyond DEI and want something that is more deliberately anti-racist or anti-discrimination, and what do they expect leaders to do for them if they're at a point where they want the leader to take them at the next step? And then what have you seen as some kind of good matches and maybe mismatches in terms of organizational and candidates expectations vis-a-vis this broader inclusivity agenda?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I think there's sort of this is a tough one both for candidates and clients, I think, because it's not, there are many people who might have a certificate in DEI or something like that, but it's not a field that's credentialed in a way that I think many other fields are. And I think what I'm seeing is clients are hoping for and expecting some level of facility and expertise literally with every role that they're hiring. So, it's not just at the top of the organization or just in the people, team, people in HR team, it's all of the roles. And typically what I think they're looking for is a sense that there is either a perspective gained through lived experience or a journey that has gone on inside of the candidate in terms of their own learning, their own ability to engage in dialogue with that sometimes is uncomfortable, to be a leader and a voice for equity in an organization. And then I think one place I see this come up a lot is any role where there's a management component. I think there's a really, really high expectation about a manager's skills in this area. How prepared are they to manage a diverse team? Particularly, I hear this come up with teams that maybe skew a little bit younger or more early career, where there's a lot of strong voices and expectations about what a workplace should offer and be like, and how do managers navigate that? I think those are the kinds of things that employers are looking for. And I think what candidates can and should do is certainly start with their own individual journey, which I think most of us in this field have to some degree. But I will also say that even just yesterday, I was debriefing after a client interview for a very high level role. And one of the things they said was, you know what, I love this candidate. They offer everything we're looking for, but their answers to the questions about diversity, equity, inclusion felt really high level. They felt like it was a lot of platitudes, a lot of buzzwords, and there were no specifics in there. And I think it's likely this candidate, who is otherwise very qualified for this job, may not get it because of that. So I think there's a real need to sort of be very specific and go deep on this topic for leaders, and be ready to demonstrate that in an interview setting. And I think that's a tall order for a lot of people when they're interviewing. But that's really what I think clients are looking for.
Well, that's fascinating. If I could just follow up on that, and something
Please.
you mentioned about, even if you've not had a certification in kind of the study of DEI, to be able to kind of convey your personal journey and your personal learnings can be quite effective. And that brings to mind something that I've been reading about, in the sense that people are expecting, either to bring your whole self to the office, or there seems to be this blending or erasure of the division between being a professional and a personal thing. So
Mm.
are people expecting you to be much more personally open and personally involved in the workplace? Are you seeing that? And how do you think about that, if that is a trend?
That's such a great question. I will tell you, I see that in our own firm, probably more than I see it in, with clients. But I think this is it is a real trend and pattern. I think when I think about great leaders, one of the aspects that I think has become more and more sought after, even though it might not be articulated as well, is this sense of vulnerability, of being open, of being able to acknowledge mistakes, of being sort of growth and learning oriented, even at the high levels of leadership. And I think that is connected to this concept of bringing your whole self to work, allowing others around you to bring their whole selves to work. And what does that mean in practice? I think it does mean being open to a much wider range of conversations, a much wider range of feedback and opinions than leaders in the past might have been. I think that's part of it. And I do think that the rising generation of employees, and again, I see this on my own team, I think a rising generation of employees who are our future leaders are looking for more of that personal connection and personal learning and really deep dialogue at work. I think that is what they're looking for. So I think this new sort of profile of a leader will have to encompass that to some degree.
That's really interesting. Greg, you have a question? Go ahead.
I'm just curious that it seems like that desire for deep personal connections at work kind of is counter to people also wanting to work remotely. Do you see like a disconnect there?
Yeah, I will tell you an observation that I have, that this is not, I'm not presenting this as my own opinion, but it's an observation I have, which is that I think the rising sort of generation of leaders tend to believe that, and really truly believe that, they can have those deep connections without being in person. And I think the folks who are further along in their career put a higher premium on in-person interactions. This is a gross generalization, but I think I see this play out a lot. And I think there is a feeling that it comes down to flexibility, right? I think it also comes down to candidates often really feeling, I need some choice. I want to be connected to my team members. I want to engage in real dialogue. I want the work that I do and the relationships I have at work to be really meaningful and go places that, are real in our life and our work. But that doesn't mean I need to be in an office every day. I think that's sort of a little bit of a contradiction that our workforce is going to be sorting out in the years to come.
Interesting. feel free to raise your hand either virtually or whichever way you want. And I see Masum. Masum, if I'm saying your name correctly, has raised her virtual hand. So Masum, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to ask a question. And thank you, Molly, so much for your presentation. I'm fascinated by this insight that you just shared about employers looking for more vulnerability and sort of people bringing their whole selves, including, I'm guessing, all aspects of their diversity, from not just like race and gender, which I feel like are most often what's connoted when people say DEI. I'm curious about whether disability is like as kind of welcome or embraced. But my question is, how do you advise candidates to straddle this balance of being vulnerable and bringing their whole selves, especially while going through an application and interview process? I mean, my understanding is that candidates are supposed to demonstrate competence, right? And like clarity and sort of, you know, like a sense that they could really do all aspects of the job, et cetera. That seems to be a little bit contradictory with the advice to kind of be vulnerable and even to some extent to bring one's whole self, because especially as a candidate, one doesn't actually yet know if that's a workplace where their whole self would be welcome, right? There's an assumption that just because an organization has a commitment to DEI that they would actually embrace all aspects of a candidate's diversity, equity, et cetera, or diversity. So I'm wondering if you have any advice for how to straddle what seems like a growing need and impulse, but also the fact that application and interview processes are not necessarily designed for somebody to be vulnerable or to be very personal in their response.
I think that's a great question. So I'm going to respond to the point about disability first, and just say that I actually think this is a relatively unexplored frontier in the whole world of diversity. I do not see a lot of clients who have comfortably moved beyond sort of, I'm sure many of you have seen that graphic about diversity where it's just the tip of the iceberg is what we see, you know, with race and gender in particular. And I think clients are still, at least our hiring clients are still very focused on those visible aspects of diversity. And I think disability is really a place where very few have gone. I mean, I can even tell you, I had a candidate not so long ago that I reached out to for a job and, you know, to say, hey, are you interested in this? And they said, are you aware that your client's website doesn't even meet the, have the, I will not say the right thing, but it doesn't have
standards.
For all those standards. You know, I think a lot of organizations haven't even gone there. So I'll just say that. And then to your other question, I mean, certainly I think it feels a little bit maybe scary and counterproductive to show vulnerability in an interview process, but I might position it slightly differently. I don't know, you know, to show vulnerability in an interview process is a tall order, but I think showing self-reflection is another way of thinking about it. You know, what have you learned from your mistakes? How do you talk about your achievements and how you got there? You know, one of the things that I hear as sort of a critical feedback in interviews all the time is, oh, so-and-so candidate always talked about what I achieved, what I did. And, you know, a really small word change, I think, shows more self-awareness, more humility, and more of like a collaborative approach, which I think is sort of connected to vulnerability. So, and I think you're right in the sense that there's a lot of trust that you would have to put out there to like bring your whole self to an interview process. But I also think, you know, if you can't bring yourself to a whole interview process or you feel that's not welcome, maybe that's not a great place for you to work at. And I think that you know, often we forget that candidates are interviewing just, you know, for their own information, just as much as clients are interviewing for the candidates they want to hire. And I think that's really critical, you know, for candidates to ask those questions and to really be clear about what they want and what they're looking for, because I think how that is received will tell you a lot about the culture of the organization.
Do you also, just to follow up on that, if we're in a situation where there is a recruiter such as yourself, would you recommend the candidate kind of approaching the recruiter if they're unsure about whether they can, I don't know, disclose certain things or ask certain things before, for example, they get an offer? I feel like recruiters can sometimes serve as that bridge and say, in advising, well, maybe wait until later in the process, or if they have information about something that may be useful.
Absolutely. Yeah. And before I answer, I just want to flag, I saw the question in the chat too. So I can work that in here. I think that when you're working with a recruiter, I would say be all in on the transparency front and ask for advice, ask for coaching. Maybe not every recruiter will provide it for you, but hopefully they will. And I think the best ones really will, And when I talk about transparency, I also think one of the things that's hardest for most humans, especially people who come from traditionally marginalized backgrounds, to talk about is money. And I, train all of our recruiters to start talking about money and compensation from day one, to revisit it throughout the process. And I'm continually blown away by how many candidates still do not say exactly what it is they are looking for or they want. And, I think that's just a great example of how a recruiter can be a real partner and help to you. And it might be about compensation. It might be about wanting to really understand the leadership style of the hiring manager, of wanting, I have candidates ask questions all the time, like, Molly, I'm pregnant and I don't feel comfortable disclosing that during this interview process. What's your advice for me there? Like, a recruiter can and should be able to help you with all of that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Let's go to Callum next, please.
Molly, thank you for being with us. And this kind of builds off the salary question. You mentioned earlier when it's a candidate's market. Are you seeing employers kind of give a salary range, but then once they meet the employee and see the candidate pool, are you seeing them blow through that salary range at all, or are you seeing them stick with the salary range to land the candidate?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think this market is really pushing a lot of our client organizations right up against many of the equity principles they have tried so hard to institute. And by that, I mean, many of the clients we work with have gone through a process over the last couple of years of reviewing compensation, creating bands, like sharing those bands publicly. Most of our clients actually are, we recommend to all of our clients that they put the compensation range in the job description so that candidates know, there are certain states, the state of New York just recently passed a law, and they were also forerunners in the not being able to ask people about their current salary as a negotiating tactic. But I think what's been really tricky in this market is candidates will come back and say, I know this is the band and I understand it, but I want to be above it. And then the client has to deal, right? Like, you can't throw all of that equity work out the window, but the candidate you want is at a certain number. And I think that's been really challenging for a lot of clients, because I do see compensation ranges creeping up from where they set out. But I will say, I think being really transparent, publishing the range, being very open about it from day one is still the best tactic, because that, it's easy to say to a candidate, like, look, this is it. This is the range. Like, we're not going to go beyond this. And then candidates really know what they're working with.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's go to Motaz.
Hi, thanks, Molly, for hosting this conversation. My question is half formed, so I'm going to do my best to make it clear. So, I was in a niche area. I think in philanthropy, I didn't see myself as being in philanthropy, and my job kind of evolved as my role did. It ended up having a conventional title, program officer. But as I'm looking for other roles now, I'm finding I have this, like, I'm looking at these roles sort of artisanally, like through my networks, people I know, other organizations that had similar focuses, but it really feels kind of whack-a-mole. And I'm wondering if that's a common experience, that people feel like, oh, that's not a good fit for me. You know, I didn't do some of these things. And I'm wondering how bullish you generally advise candidates to be like, no, if it looks close enough, if roles evolve and people do want that added value, that's the first part of my question. And the other half is, you know, in the very beginning of my search, I wanted to work with a recruiter, but the impression, someone to help guide me through the landscape and someone to help me see like, hey, look here, use this language, not that. But my impression was that recruiters were really focused on senior and executive level candidates, not mid-career kind. I'm like, you know, 40, I have a 15, 20 years experience. So I don't feel like there are recruiters for me. Are there? And how might I find them?
Yeah. Okay. So first question, I just want to make sure I'm understanding it. It sounds like maybe the role that you've been in had like a particular title, and then when you look at other ones that have similar titles or jobs, you see that you can bring some of those things that they say they want, but not all. And should you go for it anyway? Is that what you're asking? I want to make sure I'm understanding the question.
Yeah, but honestly, to clarify, I kind of foresaw that happening, and so I advocated for my role to become program officer, so I could become a known quantity for this reason. And yet, still, I hold that question.
Yeah. Well, first of all, that was smart. You know, this is actually it actually comes down to an equity principle as well, right? Like there's all kinds of research that show, for example, women are much less likely to apply for a job if they can't check off 90% of the qualifications listed in a job description, whereas men are much more likely to apply even when they don't meet the majority of those qualifications. I'm sure that gap is even larger if anybody has done a study on people of color, which I haven't seen. So I think I think it's really hard to get past a frontline hiring manager if your resume doesn't like line up in a way that's instantly recognizable to them. And I think maybe this is connected to a question in the chat too, right? Like it's sort of like, how do you get past that first line? And I actually saw a study, I'll have to look it up, just recently. Somebody did a study about bots and how they scan resumes and are often, discounting leaders of color who meet the qualifications otherwise for all kinds of reasons. So I think this is a real quandary. And I think my advice would be, I think this is where you need to find a connection, right? Like if there's a job that really speaks to you, at least from what you can see on paper, that's at an organization that you feel like you would really like to work at. And I'll put an asterisk there and say, I think doing a little bit of research can help you know if this actually is a job that's a fit. So, look at people who are sort of seem to be at that organization on LinkedIn, look at their backgrounds. Do they seem relevant to yours? Like, do they seem like they have the same kind of career experience, all of that? And then I think battling your way towards some kind of connection is a really good way to get past that. So that would probably be my advice there. But generally speaking, I do think you should apply for jobs even if you don't meet all of the qualifications. But I think getting past that first barrier is going to be harder. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's my advice there. And then the second part of the question, it is true. I think most recruiters, executive recruiters, are focused on C-level. In part, that's an economics piece, right? Like nonprofits don't have the resources to spend on recruiters for mid-level. But there are a couple of firms out there, I think, that do that kind of work. And they tend to be much smaller, like 1 or 2 person shop type firms. So there's probably some good Google searching you could do in your community that you could find a smaller firm. So most firms, just so you know, have like a minimum fee, right, that they'll take. So if the compensation range is below a certain number, they're not going to take that search. So if you're in that range, like, you know, like there's not a lot of quid pro quo there, just to be totally honest. That's how the economics of this work. But, you know, that said, I think there's some great firms that I've come into contact with, and even ourselves, we do work at probably, I would say, more of the senior end of the mid range, if that's such a thing. I think it's worth it always to send a resume and try to make a connection, like even a 5-minute conversation with a recruiter, and just say, am I somebody you would work with? But I also think, as I've been saying about this landscape in this market and how crazy it is and how competitive, that means that every search firm is also over capacity. And, you know, so I think there's just a busyness there that will be challenged to get through. But I think it's still worth trying to make that connection with the recruiter.
So Molly, on the topic of connection, one of the things we advise our students and alumni, especially if they're interested in a career change or going to an adjacent career, which we see a lot of people currently wanting to do something more, especially in the equity space. One of the things we advise them to is to search for kind of an informational interview, which what is your experience with that tactic of asking for an informational interview where you're not putting the person on the spot for kind of being a job on the line?
I mean, I think that is sort of the networking in the virtual world, right? Like you're not going to conferences anymore or events like that. So I think an informational interview is a really good idea. I think you kind of have to have a little bit of a thick skin though, and realize that you may not get a response your first or second outreach. I think especially with if you're reaching out to a recruiter for an informational interview, I would say you want to be persistent. But I also think thinking about what is it that you could offer that person is really important too. And when it comes to recruiters, you know, the person I'm most likely to spend some time with is the person who has looked at all the searches we're doing and says, hey, I have a candidate I might suggest for one of those searches. Would you spend 5 minutes with me? And I can tell you a little bit about myself, and I'd be happy to open my network to you as well.
So always do your homework, I think, right? That's great advice. Yeah. Callum, you're next on my screen.
Thanks, Amir. Molly, all of us have kind of made a first step with school here, whether it's a certificate program, an undergrad, a master's, but how much weight are you seeing the kind of educational field playing when you're hiring, say, a C-suite executive? And, you know, and I have my master's from the school. It's the best school of philanthropy in the world. But there's a period where, you know, the next step for me would be able to do a PhD or an EDD. How much weight are you seeing in the industry from a nonprofit field, or specifically a higher education field, for kind of the C-suite jobs?
Mm-hmm. I think that when I look at a candidate, especially sort of a sector switcher, which is what we call them, you know, but someone who's doing career pivot, I think the commitment to sort of a degree or a program that all of you have made, it is a massive asset. You know, it shows real commitment and demonstrates sort of mission alignment, focus. Like, I think that's really critical. I would say that the sort of next level degree probably balances out against experience. It depends on the job though. You know, it really, I don't know that there's a blanket statement to that answer to that question. I think it really is role dependent. Like, for example, at a CEO, it depends on the organization, right? And the role. If sort of specific content expertise is really important, then an advanced degree would be a huge asset. But if what they're really looking for is general management experience, you know, maybe not quite as much. So that's probably a very unsatisfying answer to the second part of your question.
That's okay. I figured you go down that route. So that's okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Molly. Mary Beth.
Thank you, Dean. What a great topic, Molly. Thank you for sharing. My question is kind of that interim period. You've made the decision you want to leave your job. You are a professional in a small field. So could you speak to professionalism, preparation, decorum? how do you prepare yourself, keep your attitude right while you are clearly growing out of the space that you're in? Thank you.
Sure. That's a really, really wonderful way of thinking about it. I think one thing I would say is, and I'm sure you've all are already doing this, but burned bridges come back to haunt people every single time. So I think, if you've made a decision to leave where you are, doing it with the utmost care and respect is critical. And I know that everyone would have that overall intention anyway. But in this market, trust me, when managers hear people are leaving, they are not handling it very well because so many people are leaving, so I think if you have the kind of relationship with your manager, many people will actually say, hey, I'm looking for other opportunities. I wanted to let you know. Like, that's a very circumstance dependent conversation, but I think that can be a very mature way to handle it. Some of it may depend on your manager and your relationship. But I think in terms of sort of keeping yourself motivated and like your head in the right place, as you said, I think it's first recognizing that being a job seeker is really time consuming and it is a very emotional process. You're putting yourself out there in very vulnerable ways. You're spending a lot of time, hopefully, on doing homework and prepping, and taking time for interviews and making yourself available with minimal advance notice. It can really be stressful. So I think to sort of expect that, acknowledge that, try to pace yourself as much as you can. If you're thinking about applying, like I wouldn't apply to 7 jobs at once because, if you were engaged in that many searches, I think that quickly becomes your full-time job. I think the other piece is also, if you are working with a recruiter and you're engaged in multiple searches, to let them know, because they can help you manage and navigate some of those timelines that will often bump up against each other. And then the last piece maybe that I might say to that question is to handle that departure with as much decorum and care as you can, to give your manager and your team. I think there's sort of a sweet spot. You don't want to give them too much notice because I think it's hard for everyone. We've probably all been in that circumstance where someone maybe has given their notice and then been around a little bit too long and everybody is ready to move on. But one thing I am seeing is that candidates are asking for longer transition times. And I think that's in part a desire to take time for themselves in between roles. And I think that's a really good, smart idea. So if you are in that place, I highly recommend making sure that you negotiate enough time to leave your current employer in a great place, but also enough time to put yourself in a great place to start a huge new challenge.
Great advice. Thank you, Molly. I'm assuming you had another question.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to ask a second question. Molly, my question is about geography. So I'm seeing an increasing trend. I think during the thick of the pandemic, there were a lot more remote work opportunities, but I'm seeing in philanthropy now, many postings are pegged to a specific location. Even if it's a hybrid arrangement, they want you to move to that place, or it's like, it'll say Washington, DC preferred or New York preferred. So how do you advise people who, one, know that they actually may not be able to move? So I live in Chicago. Moving to New York, a much more expensive market, is a tough prospect for me. But also, like, if I see a job that says New York preferred, should I apply, or will there be candidates who live in New York who are going to be given more consideration? And when a job description states a location, is it at all negotiable if you're a good candidate, or will they automatically discount you or not look at you as seriously if you don't live in that place? I think it seemed like during the thick of the pandemic, there was more flexibility, and I feel like there's slightly less flexibility as somebody who just looks at postings. And I'm curious as to what you see like on the
Yeah.
inside as a recruiter.
I think this is sort of, I mentioned in the opening remarks, like I think candidates are still very interested in working remotely, and I think hiring managers are interested in shifting back to less remote work.
Yeah.
So I think some of this is still working its way out. I would say that if you see a job description that says, you know, DC preferred, I would interpret that as all things being equal. If there is a candidate who brings very similar set of qualifications and experiences and is in DC, they will likely choose that candidate over someone who is not. But if there's like someone who is perceived as a superstar and an amazing fit, they are willing to make virtual work. So I think to your question, like if you see New York preferred, should you bother applying? If you think it's a really good fit, yes. Because I think to me that indicates they are open to remote people, though it's not their first preference. I think if you see a job description that says, you know, Minneapolis, this job is based in Minneapolis, it's unlikely there will be a lot of flexibility, but I think there's what I see now are employers trying to sort of have it both ways. They want someone in an office or in a particular location if they can get them there, but maybe for the right person, they would be willing to consider remote, which makes it very difficult for candidates to know where they stand. So I think my advice to you is on the preferred front, I would still apply if you think it's a good fit. When they say there's a location, I think it's okay to apply, but I would be pretty upfront about the fact that you don't intend to relocate.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So Molly, let me continue on the theme of noticeability and leadership in some way. You've mentioned to us that there seems to be an emerging premium being placed on vulnerability and self-reflection, especially as it's connected to issues of equity and inclusiveness as well. Are there other kind of leadership qualities that tend to jump out at you? You know, I think we've all encountered people at various levels of hierarchy where we think, wow, that's a bright light and we need to follow that person. Is there something like that you see in general? And if you do, are there personality differences? Are there ways to become brighter in the eyes of others? What's your experience?
Yeah. I mean, I think probably the two building blocks, I might put three building blocks to sort of leadership that I see most commonly, not in order of any priority, but one is, I would say, this big bucket of communications and relationship building. I think communications skills cannot be undervalued in any leadership role whatsoever at all. So that's the ability to communicate well one-on-one, the ability to be inspirational in a group setting, the ability to give direct, clear feedback, even if it's critical feedback. You know, those are, I think that communications and relationship building, that's just a super critical foundational piece of leadership. And I think it's a skill that many of us are not taught, that we sort of develop on our own, don't get a ton of feedback about. I think many of us think we're great communicators, but if we asked others, maybe they would not have the same opinion. So, and we probably see that in our personal lives too. So I think focusing on your communication skills in every aspect, right? Like whether that's how you write an email to how you communicate in small group meetings, one-on-one meetings, and asking others for feedback on that is a really great way to grow, but I think is often underrated. The other sort of a building block that I think about for leadership is strategy. And I think that's sort of a given, right? Everyone thinks a good leader should be highly strategic. And the way I often think about it is the ability to sort of see an end goal and then create a roadmap that leads to that end goal in which every person involved in the process understands their place, their deliverables, and how they contribute to that end goal. And then a track record of actually achieving those kinds of goals. That's often what I'm looking for when I think about what makes a leader. And then I think the other piece that I'm seeing a lot is I think there's a big difference between leadership and management. I think being a great manager day in and day out doesn't necessarily make one a great leader. And I think the opposite is true too. So I think that's where some of this self-reflection and a little bit of like humility and vulnerability come into play. I'll use myself as an example. I've had to work super, super hard at being a better manager day in and day out, because I tend to be a little bit at a higher level. And I think I often have to bring myself back down and ask myself, what is it that this group of people needs from me today to do their jobs, even if I don't have a lot of patience for that. So I think being able to toggle between management and leadership and understanding the differences there, that's a really like a nuanced lens on leadership. So in terms of, I think the last part of your question was, how do you gain all of those experiences? I mean, certainly it's just time, right? And the opportunity, but I do feel like there are a lot of experiences that folks can get simply by asking for them that they don't always ask for. So I think by saying, you know, to whether it's your manager or a board member or whomever, you know, this is a kind of experience I'd like to grow into more. Can you help me identify opportunities for this? And I would be super specific, right? Like it's whether it's project-based, whether it's leading a particular kind of meeting or event, whether it's you know, working with a particular client experience that you've never had. I mean, it might be very different, but I think being really clear about what experiences you want to put in your toolbox and then asking for help creating those opportunities. I think that's a really good way to gain those experiences that sometimes when you look at a great leader, it seems like it's all just baked in and comes naturally.
I think that's really interesting advice, because sometimes we get really anxious about, I need a mentor who's going to be a wraparound guru for me. But you're saying just go ask and say, you know, I'd like to do X, Y, Z or X, and you know, I'd love to do that for you. Can you help me, you know, do it for you and learn in the process, right? It's something like that, right?
Yeah. I mean, look, not every manager is going to be able to deliver on that, but I think the more specific we all are about what we're seeking, the more likely it is that someone will help us achieve it.
And I bet you your current boss will think that you're showing initiative usually, right? If he's a good boss or
Yep.
she's a good boss, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So before we let you go, maybe you could share a little bit more about, you know, what do you read? Who do you talk to stay abreast of kind of the key developments in the sector, especially as it's related to some of the trends that you've detected?
Sure.
What do you pay attention to?
Yeah. I will never profess to be able to go deep in this many publications, but I'm a big scanner of headlines of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Chronicle of Philanthropy. And then I also follow a lot of like sort of like micro interest groups on LinkedIn, where people are often posting interesting news stories. I follow a lot of my clients on Twitter, which I think actually has helped me gain like just incredible insights into how some of the greatest leaders think and what they talk about and care about. That's actually been a huge education for me. Every once in a while, when I used to travel all the time, I probably did more reading, I will be honest. I also read Harvard Business Review, get the newsletters. So I'm a big reader and I'm a big scanner of the news. So that's important to me in terms of really understanding what's going on. And I also really try to encourage folks on my team to sort of do that and then share with each other, like interesting stories that we see, because nobody can be on top of everything all the time. So I think sometimes it's helpful to have like a group effort there about, hey, did you see this? This is kind of interesting. And we'll share things back and forth that way. But those are my go-tos. And then for pleasure, I'm definitely a fiction reader. So reading is a big piece of my life, but I don't read any, I'm not a nonfiction reader. I'm a news reader and a fiction reader. That's a big piece
What
of
fiction are you reading now?
Oh my gosh. I tend to go in spurts. So I recently have been on a murder mystery spree. But let's see, before that, what books have I read? Well, so I have a 17-year-old daughter who we trade some books back and forth. She's a big Kristen Hanna reader. I don't know if people have read her stuff. So I'm pretty voracious. I read around, but I do like a good murder mystery.
That's great. Well, we love any firm that pays that much attention to reading, and I think that's very in sync with our ethos here. And we do think that people who read tend to be more effective at what they do, but that's a bias that we have. So
I would share that bias, I think.
is there anything we didn't ask you that we should have asked you? Any closing comments you have before we thank you for being so generous with your time?
Oh, no. I don't think so. The only thing is, I know somebody asked quickly about a cover letter. I will tell you quite honestly, I am looking at experience first and story second when I'm thinking about candidates. So, you know, if you feel like your cover letter is the piece that's not getting you through the door, it could be that your experience isn't lining up with what they're looking for. But like, that's just my own piece. So I just wanted to address that. But in general, no, I think you've asked me all kinds of great things. I would say this is a good time to make a career change because there's lots of opportunities out there. But I think my advice to career seekers more than anything is just homework. Do your homework, look at everything, look at even glass ceilings so you can see what people think about employees. Not everybody's out there talking about it. Ask your friends on LinkedIn, really do your homework. I think that's critical.
Great. Yeah. And if you're looking for a great job opportunity, if you're already employed at the school, that's not for you. So
yes, correct. You close your ears.
That's great. Now we've had a lot of turnover too, and have some wonderful new colleagues through the process as well. And you have to be a great place for people to stay. So we appreciate that. But thank you, Molly, for a very stimulating and enlightening conversation. And many thanks
for your time.
Thanks to
Molly.
those of you who have joined us as well. I just want to let you know before we applaud is that just save the date for September 21 and 22, where we have our Science of Philanthropy Initiative Conference, where John List, our visiting Hartog chair from Chicago, will be with us, as well as Cecilia Conrad from Liver for Change, Daniel Hungerman from Notre Dame, and Azim Sharif from the University of British Columbia. To learn more about the Science of Philanthropy, go to spihub, spihub.org. But the most important thing is to unmute and give a big round of applause to Molly. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you,
Thank
Molly.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.